Hi and welcome back to the course. Last video we left it on a bit of a cliffhanger before implementing authentication, but in this video we're going to finalize that and explain the entire flow and how it works. The first thing we have to do is set up JWT to work with our app. So let's import from Flask_JWT. We're going to import JWT. Now remember to set the app's secret key, that's important. And then we're going to create something called JWT equals JWT app, authenticate, and identity. Now these two names may sound familiar because they are indeed what we implemented earlier. So in the last video, we implemented inside security.py two important functions, authenticate and identity. When we initialize the JWT object, that is going to use our app, the authenticate and the identity functions together to allow for authentication of users. So here's how it's going to work. JWT creates a new endpoint. That endpoint is /auth. When we call /auth, we send it a username and a password. And the JWT extension gets that username and password and sends it over to the authenticate function. That takes in a username and a password. We're then going to find the correct user object using that username, and we're going to compare its password to the one that we receive through the auth endpoint. If they match, we're going to return the user, and that becomes sort of the identity. So what happens next is the auth endpoint returns a JWT token, a JW token. Now, that JW token in itself doesn't do anything, but we can send it to the next request we make. So when we send a JW token, what JWT does is it calls the identity function. And then it uses the JWT token to get the user ID, and with that, it gets the correct user for that user ID that the JWT token represents. And if it can do that, that means that the user was authenticated, the JWT token is valid, and all is good. So from Flask JWT, we're going to import JWT and JWT required. And that is a decorator that we are going to call in front of our get method. So what's going to happen now is that we are going to have to authenticate before we can call the get method. So let's go over to Postman. And in here, just go to 5000/auth. So we've got here a new endpoint that we've not created. The JWT token creates that for us. Sorry, not the JWT token. The JWT extension creates that for us. And all we have to do is pass in a username and a password. So the headers, authorization have to be JSON, has to be a post, and in the body, we're going to pass in, sorry, not authorization, content type, what am I talking about? Here we're going to pass in a username, which has to be Bob, and a password, which has to be ASDF. These have to match exactly the ones in our in-memory database. Okay, I'm going to save this now, and there we've got our auth endpoint. So what do you think is going to happen when we press send? Well, let's try it out. That's some sort of funny thing that happened there. We have to be running our app, of course. Let's do it again. There we go. Now we have the JWT back. This is the JWT, it's pretty long. And what we're going to do is copy that. So just select the entire thing without the quotation marks and copy it. And then we're going to create a new item. So I'm going to create a piano, for example. And as you know, this does not require a JW token. So we should be able to do it just fine because we've not really changed anything. And as you can see, the piano comes back and all is good. We can call our items endpoint, which returns a list of items. And that returns just the list of items as it did in the last video. But finally, let's call for a specific item. And voila, we get some sort of error message. The request does not contain an access token, and status code is 401, which means unauthorized, and the error is that authorization is required. So we're missing something here. And so we are, because we have to send in the JW token so that Flask JWT can understand that we are a user that has logged in the past. And the way we do that is we put in a new header, which is authorization, and the value is really important, has to be JWT space, and then paste in the entire token, which is a pretty long thing, and that is it. Then press send, and we get our piano back. So that's what logged in means to a server. It means, can you prove that you are somebody? And we can prove it if we send in this authorization header. Flask JWT is going to look at the authorization header, it's going to understand that we are a user, and with this, it's going to decode it, it's going to retrieve a user ID from it, and in our security file, it's going to call the identity payload, it's going to get the user ID, and then it's going to get the correct user for that ID. And because that user does exist, Bob and SDF, then it knows that we are logged in, and then we run this method. So hopefully all of that made sense, and authentication generally is quite a confusing and complex thing, but Flask JWT really does make it a lot simpler than it has been in the past. So hopefully all that's okay. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the very next video.